31 people have been arrested following a major investigation into human trafficking. Police in York region, north of Toronto, say officers from several provinces took part in the operation. More than 300 charges have been laid. The lead inspector says it appears to be run by a criminal organization operating across Canada.
The uniqueness of this is that we've actually identified an actual criminal organization that is not only involved, primarily involved with human trafficking, but they're involved with every other offense that we've listed, predominantly frauds. And what we've identified is that organized frauds are occurring across the country. The profit from the frauds that the organization is making is fueling the human trafficking.
CBC's Ellen Morrow was at that news conference. What else did police reveal, Ellen?
Well, Suhanna, York Regional Police described an elaborate human trafficking network, an alleged human trafficking network. I spoke to Ty Trong, the inspector who you heard just there. He said this is one of the most sophisticated alleged networks he's ever seen in his decade of looking into these crimes. And the numbers here are staggering. As you said, police believe, they say, this network spanned the entire country, with women being trafficked largely from Quebec to Ontario to Western provinces. And as you also said, they've arrested more than 30 people in connection with this alleged crime network. More than 300 charges have been laid, and more charges are expected as this is an ongoing investigation. And 12 victims have been officially identified. Now, this investigation called Project Convalesce began a year ago in October 2018 when police, the York Regional Police, began looking into a man named Jonathan Anguilla, believed to be the alleged kingpin of this organization. And the reason they began looking into him at that time was two women who were in Vaughan, Ontario, not far from Toronto, came forward to authorities. Inspector Trong said those women were essentially at the end of their rope and had nowhere else to turn to, so reached out to the police. Now, Inspector Trong also went over the scope of this alleged network, as well as some of the methods he says the suspected pimps used to control the alleged victims. Here's more of what he had to say.
They were working for him. They tried to leave and tried to make their own money, and at which point he tracked them down and tried to make sure that that didn't happen. We're seeing a lot of girls that will try and leave their pimp on their own, try and evade the violence, and they get found, they get beaten, they get assaulted as a result of getting found.
This is an ongoing investigation, Alan, so there might be more to come, but did police give any indication of where the investigation is taking them?
Well, they say they've identified 30 other women as potentially connected with this alleged network. They're urging those women to come forward and speak to authorities, although they're also acknowledging that's a difficult thing for women in this type of organization to do. And this still is an investigation that is spanning across multiple provinces. It is ongoing, so police couldn't get into too much of the specifics, but their priority is reaching out to those 30 other women potentially connected and helping them to potentially escape this network and get the supports that they need.
Thanks for that, Ellen. CBC's Ellen Morrow in Aurora, Ontario. We are following a developing story just north of Toronto. Police have arrested 31 people in a major investigation into human trafficking and organized crime. My next guest is a human trafficking survivor. She is also the founder of what's called the RISE Initiative. It's a project aimed at helping victims of human trafficking. Ronelle Bruder is in Toronto. Ronelle, great to have you on the program. And this is a huge story and a huge investigation. Yeah. Police say hundreds of charges, including for human trafficking and pimping, and 45 young women could be involved as victims. Does any of this surprise you?
Sadly, it doesn't surprise me. My trafficking situation happened almost 20 years ago. So this has been going on for a long time. It's just only recently that human trafficking is getting attention.
Police did call it a unique investigation, though. Based on what, would you say?
I think it was the fact that it was so organized. So typically what you see in human trafficking is you'll have one trafficker or pimp with a couple of girls, a stable of girls. But what it seems like what they had here was 4 or 5 multiple different traffickers working together in an organized format and actually trading the girls between them.
The girls were being moved mainly from Quebec, the majority of them, but to Ontario and other provinces across the country. Is that par for the course as well?
Yes, that's very common. So one of the things the traffickers try to do is isolate and also disorient their victims. So moving them from place to place, that makes it easier. So the young girls don't know where they are, harder to ask for help.
I want to say these are all charges right now. These are only allegations, so there certainly will be further investigatory details, etc., and we'll be watching for those. But as for the women who have come forward, police say there were 45 young women involved. Only a dozen or so are speaking out. Let me get your thoughts on how difficult it is to point the finger, even though perhaps you know you might be safe now.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a real challenge for law enforcement. One reason, just obviously the fear of violence and threats if they speak against their trafficker. And also for a lot of the women, just the shame and the stigma around this, not wanting to go out and actually having to publicly announce that you are a survivor of human trafficking.
How big a problem is that, the stigma? Because, you know, we say, and we see ads for it, let's talk about things. Let's talk about, you know, mental illness. Let's talk about breast cancer. Let's talk about things that perhaps were subjects people weren't comfortable with. Why isn't this on that list of let's talk about it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different reasons why human trafficking isn't something that you really see a lot of people talking about. But I think there's a lot of shame just around women working in the sex industry in general. So there's a lot of stigma there. And so for survivors of human trafficking, there's a lot of guilt because this is something that they have this experience. A lot of people might actually blame them. Mm-hmm. Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you run away? Because a lot of people don't understand the psychological and emotional trauma that traffickers inflict on their victims.
So let me say to you, honestly, those are questions running through my mind. How do you answer them?
Sorry, which questions?
The questions of why didn't you leave?
Yeah, and so I was just kind of speaking to that point. It's really due to the psychological trauma. So traffickers are able to sort of groom their victims, create the sense that they're the only person that matters, they're the only person in the world that you have, and they instill such fear, such physical fear and emotional fear that for many women, they're afraid to leave. They're afraid to even ask to go to the washroom. I mean, this is the level of control and fear that these traffickers are inflicting.
Final question for you. What will you be watching for in the days ahead as we continue here on CBC News Network to track this story, Renelle?
Yeah, so really, I'm hoping to see more charges come out of this. So I'm really interested in, I think it's the remaining 33 women that they've discovered, and I'm hoping that there'll be more charges of human trafficking against these men.
I thank you for being so forthcoming and talking about this. As you say, you know, no stigma, got to talk about it, right?
Exactly. That's the only way that we can address the problem, if we have these conversations.
I thank you for your time. That's Renelle Bruder. She is a survivor of human trafficking, and our chase team reached her in Toronto.
It is 6:41, and right now a story sure to make you shake your head. Amazon's been selling an electronic book titled The Pedophile's Guide to Love and Pleasure, a Child Lover's Code of Conduct. A Colorado man wrote the book. He put it up for sale on Amazon.com, sparking outrage. Hundreds of people chimed in on this one, threatening to boycott Amazon until it removed the book. Well, the author says he wanted to establish rules for pedophiles so they don't hurt children, because he thinks pedophilia isn't necessarily wrong.
Well, to tell you the truth, I don't think that it's always bad for the child, okay? But I do think it's always confining for the adult. If it was just something that the child didn't have any problems with, maybe a fine of some kind. But if it was actual physical harm or mental trauma, a few years in jail perhaps.
All right, we did a background check on that man, on the author. He has not been charged with any sexual crimes. He also said he was not molested as a child and that he's never touched a child as an adult. And as we showed you last hour, Amazon's webpage for this book, it's not working this morning. So at least for now, it appears they have pulled the book for sale. Dear, we're going to keep an eye on this one. Amazon had first said that it would be censorship to pull this book, and then we checked this morning and the book's gone.
Yeah.
In the virtual world, he was the undisputed leader of the globe's biggest child abuse site. An online network of pedophiles in dozens of countries.
Everything from babies and toddlers right up to, what they would describe as jailbait.
The material that was particularly being produced by this group, we knew was happening almost live and on demand.
He is a predator. An extremely dangerous individual as far as I'm concerned.
To catch this predator would take a unique operation, involving the coordinated efforts of police from Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, the United States and Australia, who would piece together the man's identity, one clue at a time.
We knew information about the administrator of the site, and we knew there were certainly significant suggestions that he was an Australian.
And as soon as we had a sniff that we were dealing with an Australian who was potentially the lead administrator, that presents a challenge that we were prepared to take on.
The head administrator presided over a site that was strictly hierarchical, with members who shared original material of them abusing children promoted, while others were punished for not meeting expectations.
So to be a member, you had to have access to child exploitation material and be posting it onto the site for others to have. And that had to be an ongoing thing. And if you'd failed to do so, you'd be removed from the site.
The level of material, the amount of material you posted was significant enough, high enough amount of material, then you could apply to move up the ranks and become a VIP.
There was no bigger VIP than the head administrator. And the suspected Australian had one of the world's best victim identification specialists on his trail.
I had photographs of him potentially abusing 7 different children, all preschool age, boys and girls, different ethnic backgrounds. Somewhere at the back of your mind, there's something saying, who the hell is this guy that he's got access to those children?
For 20 years, Paul Griffiths has trawled through images of child abuse for clues to the identities of victims and perpetrators. To unmask the head administrator, Griffiths would have to piece together a scattering of leads. Among them, an unusual greeting the man used online.
And one of the things that I noticed was that on a number of occasions he's used that specific greeting, HIAS, H-I-Y-A-S.
After ruling out women who used HIAS as a greeting, and after sifting through thousands of sites and discussion boards, Griffiths found a man who consistently used the word. That led to a Facebook page, a photo of a VW utility and a city.
I mean, the Facebook profile was completely bogus, but it did have that clue for Adelaide. It did point us in the direction of Adelaide. I actually found him asking questions online about how to raise the suspension on his four-wheel drive.
He made mistakes, but any one of those mistakes in isolation was not enough to identify him.
Good afternoon, Special Crimes Branch.
How many of you got there? Who've got in the team?
But the VW ute would help piece together the jigsaw.
He's actually posted a photograph of his vehicle, and he also signs off his messages with the name Shannon. So that from the information we've got from that registration plate, it would appear to be registered to someone by the name of Shannon McCool.
Queensland's Task Force Argos finally had a name. It was time to brief their counterparts in South Australia's Sex Crimes Investigation Branch.
There's been a number of strings of information that have now come together that the risk is in your jurisdiction.
The risk was massive because 32-year-old Shannon McCool was charged by the state with looking after dozens of vulnerable children. And he'd been proudly posting evidence of his own sexual abuse of those in his care.
Looks like he's also employed with Families SA as some sort of care worker in the southern suburbs.
That's obviously quite concerning I imagine definitely at your end.
What I can see so far, there seems to be 7 different children, so 3 girls and 4 boys, and we're talking pretty hardcore material on all of the children.
It was probably the worst I've ever seen. You know, the material's horrific, there's no other word for it, and he'd probably had access to hundreds of children.
With McCool able to access children at will, the Queenslanders and South Australians coordinated a plan.
Obviously we have to move as quickly as possible. Read children at risk.
Getting a live capture is critical.
Well, basically, John, as soon as you guys can get down here, we'll be going in. Obviously, what you've said, it's imperative that, we get him whilst he's got his computer running.
4 days later, police moved in.
Myself and a colleague attended his address 7 o'clock at night, and it was as simple as knocking on his door. He opened the door, and before he had the opportunity to do anything, he was secured in the premises. He was a bit shook up and very quiet. He was at a point he was almost physically sick at one point.
It was from this house in suburban Adelaide that Shannon McCool secretly ran a global internet child pornography ring that had tens of thousands of members. Rising to head administrator, McCool had complete control over the network, a role only made possible by his unfettered access to children in his care. The public servant, who'd repeatedly abused vulnerable kids as young as 18 months old, was quickly identified by his own depraved internet posts.
We had some images of an individual we believed to be him, the individual from the site, sexually abusing children. He had a distinguishing mark of a freckle on his finger.
I think it became apparent when we asked to look at his hands, and particularly when his hands were photographed, and the famous freckle on his finger was pointed out and confirmed.
Shannon McCool was in custody, but Task Force Argos wasn't finished. It was time for Phase 2 of its operation.
Phase 2, for me, was to take over the network, assume control of the network, and ultimately identify as many criminal offences committed by members of the network as we could before ultimately destroying it.
But infiltrating and running a global child abuse site presented a dilemma for Argos. How to keep the network going without allowing the sexual abuse of children to continue.
There was just no way on earth that we are going to allow the sexual abuse of children to continue. So we closed membership. Nobody gets in. Effectively, we caged the rats.
2 Task Force Argos detectives pretended to be Shannon McCool, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
And it can mess with your head. So it's not something you want to do for really long, protracted periods of time.
But this covert operation would go on for 10 months, and the Argos infiltrators would help authorities round up pedophiles across the world, from the United States to Europe and Asia.
We're stretching the bounds of what has ever been done before.
As each of these caged rats was rounded up, they were replaced by undercover police. But John Rouse refuses to measure the operation's success in arrests.
I think in terms of the identification of child victims, and that's what it was all about. There was a lot of kids that are in a better place now because of what happened across the globe.
Potentially hundreds of kids?
Yeah.
This month, Shannon McCool was sentenced to a record 35 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 28 years.
Sometimes things are a little bit beyond comprehension, to be honest. But that is how calculating he was, so... sometimes it's very hard to understand how he could have done what he did.
We see ourselves as the lucky ones in that we can actually do something about it rather than just sitting back and thinking, oh, that's terrible and there's nothing we can do.